Imagine spending years without leaving your room. No stepping outside, no conversations, no job, no school, just the room, the bed, the silence. Time dissolves, days turn into weeks, weeks into months, and life becomes a loop of stillness. Now, realize this isn't fiction. It's not an exaggeration. It's the reality of hundreds of thousands of young people in Japan who have chosen to disappear from the world while still alive. They're known as hikikomori, a Japanese word that literally means pulling inward or being confined. But this isolation doesn't happen by accident. It's not just shyness or laziness. It's a complex, deeply human phenomenon, a quiet symptom of a society that may have forgotten how to care. A scream without sound, echoing behind bedroom walls and digital screens. In 2024, Japan's Ministry of Health estimated there are over 1.5 million hikikomori. That's roughly 1% of the population, young people between the ages of 15 and 39 who for different reasons have chosen or been pushed into a life with no social interaction. Some have remained isolated for more than 10 years. To many, this might sound like a uniquely Japanese issue, distant, unusual, even dramatic. But the truth is, hikikomori is much closer than we think. It's not just an individual issue, it's a global collapse of belonging, of connection, of meaning. So the real question is, why would someone choose to disappear from society? Why would a young, physically healthy person choose complete silence over being part of the world? To answer that, we must ask an even deeper question. What kind of world are we building, where disappearing feels safer than showing up? In Japan, the causes are layered. Culturally, Japanese society places intense value on harmony, social image, and success. Even small failures, a bad grade, a lost job, being bullied, can feel unbearable. And here's the heartbreaking part. Even their parents often don't know what to do. They pay the bills, leave food by the door, wait. Days pass, months, sometimes years. No shouting, no confrontation, just silence, like an invisible contract of surrender. A study by Kyushu University found that over 60% of hikikomori began withdrawing during adolescence, often after facing shame, bullying, or intense pressure to perform. More than half suffer from severe anxiety, depression, or personality disorders. But before we start labeling them as mentally ill, we should pause. Because maybe the problem isn't that these young people are too fragile, but that the world has become too hostile. Hikikomori isn't just a personal breakdown. It's a social warning, a mirror reflecting something many of us feel, even if we don't lock ourselves in a room. It's a symptom of a world that feels increasingly overwhelming and disconnected. This isn't limited to Japan. In South Korea, where the pressure to succeed is just as intense, over 500,000 young people are estimated to be living in similar reclusion. In Italy, researchers from the University of Padua report rising numbers of young adults withdrawing from public life. In Spain, a similar condition is now referred to as the digital hermit syndrome. And in Brazil, therapists are increasingly reporting cases of young people who haven't left home in months, sometimes years. We are witnessing a new form of disappearance, a generation that is fading out without dying. Technology, while not the root cause, makes this withdrawal easier. Online gaming, social media, food delivery, you can live an entire life without stepping outside, without being seen, without being confronted. But the point here is not to blame or romanticize. It's to understand, because a hikikomori isn't just someone who locks themselves away. It's someone who's opted out of the noise, the competition, the pressure, the expectations. And in doing so, they reveal something we don't want to see. Maybe the problem isn't inside the room, but outside of it. In a documentary by NHK, a mother says, "My son isn't lazy, he's just afraid, afraid to fail again, afraid he won't be accepted, afraid to go out and be broken." That single sentence captures something deep. Hikikomori isn't about avoiding life, it's about avoiding judgment. In Japan, there's a word for that. Sekentei. The fear of losing face, the burden of being seen as a failure, a pressure to appear perfect, even when everything inside is falling apart. And if we're honest, many of us feel a version of that, maybe not to the extreme, but who hasn't wanted to disappear for a while? Who hasn't felt suffocated by expectations? That's why hikikomori isn't just a Japanese issue, it's a universal signal. A quiet alarm that something somewhere is deeply broken, and this is just the beginning. In the next part, we'll go deeper. We'll explore the structures that lead to this silent collapse, the systems that seem normal but quietly push people to the edge. We'll look at how society creates unbearable weight and why some choose not to carry it anymore. Most importantly, we'll explore what hikikomori can teach us about ourselves. It's easy to think of hikikomori as someone weak, someone who couldn't handle life, who gave up too easily, but that's a shallow and dangerous way to see it. Because when we begin to understand the world they're retreating from, the question shifts. Maybe they're not too fragile, maybe the world has become too heavy. To understand hikikomori, we need to look beyond the bedroom walls. We need to examine the invisible systems, cultural, economic, psychological, that quietly pressure young people to the breaking point. Japan is known for its order, discipline, and work ethic. But those same qualities come with immense pressure. From a young age, children are pushed to excel. Grades, behavior, appearances, everything matters. And failure. In Japan, failure isn't just a setback. It's a social stain. At school, bullying is common, often ignored by adults who prioritize group harmony over confrontation. According to Japan's Ministry of Education, more than 615,000 cases of school bullying were officially reported in 2023 alone. But many experts say the real number is much higher. For a teenager who's humiliated or ostracized, the safest option often becomes retreat. This pressure doesn't ease in adulthood. Japan's corporate world is rigid and unforgiving. Hierarchy is strict. Mistakes are punished. Overtime is expected. So much so that there's a word for it, karoshi, death by overwork. People literally work themselves to death. Heart attacks, suicides, mental breakdowns. In this landscape, the hikikomori is not irrational. They are, in many ways, responding logically to an illogical world. But Japan isn't alone. All around the world, a similar pattern is emerging. Young people collapsing under invisible weight. In South Korea, high academic pressure and rigid social norms have led to a spike in both youth suicide and extreme isolation. In the US, the CDC reported a 60% rise in depression among teenagers over the past decade. In Brazil, mental health professionals are sounding alarms about the rise of anxious, withdrawn youth with no will to engage socially. It doesn't matter where you look. The shape may change, but the pressure is global. We now live in what philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls the burnout society, a world where external oppression has been replaced by internal self-pressure. In his book, The Burnout Society, Han explains, "Today, we are not forced to work by others. We force ourselves. And that's more effective because we don't even notice it. Modern society tells us you can do anything. So if you fail, it's your fault. We are told to be productive, happy, attractive, and resilient all the time. We must hustle, perform, optimize, smile. But no one tells us how to simply be human. The hikikomori, in this sense, becomes a silent rebel, not a dropout, but a refuser. Someone who no longer wants to play a game that feels rigged. This isn't laziness, it's exhaustion. Not just physical, but existential, a collapse of motivation, of belonging, of purpose. Think about social media, a space filled with perfectly edited lives. Even when we know it's fake, it affects us. Comparison becomes constant. And comparison, as the old saying goes, is the thief of joy. Centuries ago, Blaise Pascal wrote, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." But maybe in the 21st century, the problem isn't being alone. Maybe the real challenge is being seen, constantly, critically, competitively. The hikikomori withdraws, not because they fear solitude, but because they fear visibility. They fear failing under society's gaze. They fear being judged, compared, corrected, and this brings us to a painful truth. Maybe the hikikomori isn't broken. Maybe they are responding honestly to a society that is constantly demanding, rarely forgiving, and deeply isolating. From a psychological standpoint, this resembles what is known as acting out, when a person expresses unspoken pain through behavior rather than words. Hikikomori then becomes a form of silent protest, not against parents or school or work, but against the entire structure of meaning in modern life. And yes, there's real suffering involved. Isolation is painful, depression is real, but treating hikikomori solely as a mental illness ignores the context that created the crisis. That's why we must shift the question again. Instead of asking, why do these young people shut themselves away? We need to ask, what kind of world makes withdrawal feel safer than participation? This is a hard question, because it forces us to reflect, not on the hikikomori, but on ourselves, on how we build communities, on how we define value, on how we treat one another. And this brings us to the next part of our journey. We've explored the symptoms. We've seen the pressure, the structure, the system that exhausts people. Now it's time to go deeper. In the next chapter, we'll ask, what is the hikikomori trying to show us about the world and about the future? And more importantly, can we still imagine a society that welcomes fragility instead of punishing it? There's no question the hikikomori phenomenon is painful, but instead of just seeing it as a problem to be fixed, maybe we need to do something harder, something deeper. We need to listen to what it's trying to tell us, because every time a young person chooses to disappear from the world, they're making a silent statement, I don't belong in this version of life. And even though those words are never spoken out loud, they form a manifesto against a society that values performance over dignity, image over honesty, success over humanity. The hikikomori doesn't want to win the game. And maybe that's not weakness. Maybe it's clarity. This is where philosophy becomes essential. The French sociologist Émile Durkheim introduced a concept called anomie, a state of normlessness, when social structures lose meaning and the individual feels adrift. The hikikomori is a modern embodiment of that, a body still alive, but a soul with no direction, someone who continues to exist biologically, but feels symbolically erased. And when that happens, the issue is no longer just personal, it becomes systemic. Sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, in his book Liquid Modernity, described our era as one of fragile ties. Relationships are disposable, commitments are shallow, everything, even human connection, is temporary. And the cost? Mass loneliness. A recent report by the World Economic Forum shows that over 30% of young Americans feel chronically lonely. In the UK, the government created an actual Ministry of Loneliness after discovering that isolation was taking a toll on both mental and physical health. And in Brazil, data from IBGE shows that over 20% of young people aged 15 to 29 say they have no meaningful support system. This is the world the hikikomori retreats from. A world where everything is connected, except people. A world that values appearances over presence, efficiency over empathy. But if we go deeper, we might realize something even more profound. Isolation isn't just pain, it's protest. A protest against speed, against noise, against a society that demands constant output and offers very little space for simply being. Maybe, deep down, the hikikomori is saying, if the world has no place for my vulnerability, then I refuse to participate in it. And that refusal, uncomfortable as it may be, holds truth. Philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." The tragedy is that many of these young people no longer see a why, and the world around them isn't offering new meanings. It offers goals, metrics, filters, followers, but not purpose. So what can we learn from all this? First, we must change the question. Not, how do we bring the hikikomori back into society? But how can we reshape society so that it becomes livable for everyone, especially those who feel left behind? We need to build a world where people matter even when they're not performing, where being quiet isn't seen as failure, where presence is more valuable than productivity, where someone's worth isn't measured by how busy they are. We also need to talk about fragility, not as a flaw to hide, but as a fundamental part of being human. Everyone breaks down, everyone feels lost at some point. But if society has no space to hold that collapse, then it isn't functioning as a society, it's just a system. The hikikomori doesn't need to be fixed, they need to be understood. They need the right to exist without constantly proving their value. And maybe, just maybe, we all need that too. Because what they're asking for isn't that different from what most of us crave. Time, peace, permission to slow down, to feel, to fail. At its core, the hikikomori isn't rejecting life. They're rejecting this version of life. One that's too loud, too fast, too lonely, and too empty. And if we're honest, maybe we feel that too. Just not enough to lock the door, not yet. This phenomenon is a warning, not just about mental health, but about meaning, about direction, about the soul of modern life. Because when someone chooses total silence over connection, it's not just a cry for help, it's an accusation that we've built a world full of voices, but with no one really listening, a world full of competition, but little compassion, a world that pushes everyone to be seen, but not truly known. And maybe, just maybe, the real illness isn't inside the bedroom of a withdrawn young person. Maybe the real illness is the world that made them feel safer alone.